Hi everyone, I'm Nicole and today we're going to be making the robot from one of my favorite movies, Castle in the Sky. I'm using this amazing book for reference, and you can see here this is the warrior robot. This one can fly, but we're going to be doing the gardener robot, and he takes care of all the little critters and plants on Laputa. There's also this cool model kit I found of the warrior robot, but we're going to be doing it the old-fashioned way. Now I just used my iPad here to draw a simple armature, and then I made it with wire, and here you can see I'm already losing my marbles. I used some smaller wire and some hot glue to do the hands, and we're going to be making this out of Fix-It Sculpt, which is a two-part epoxy clay that you mix together. Here I want to stabilize my joints in the hands so nothing moves around on me. I went ahead and used some clay to attach the magnets to the bottom of the feet so that he can come off the base we're going to make later. I strengthened up the hips a little bit, and then I bulked out the torso. This is going to save on clay and also make sure he's not too top-heavy. I had to get creative to make some thin but also very strong armature for the arms and legs. This is a technique that worked for me. I peeled off the foil later, and here we're left with a pretty sturdy little armature. We're going to work on the waist first, and then work our way out. Once I get that waist all nice and smooth, I'm going to texture it with a toothbrush and go over it with a little bit of water. Now I'm going to move on to the neck. Here I'm just doing the same process of texturing and going over it with water. Then I do an impromptu little shake test there, I don't know why. And now we're going to work on that chest. I found a reference I really liked that showed them at all different angles, so that's the one I'm going to be using. I'm making my clay into a sheet and pressing it into the foil. Then I use my fingers to push the clay around. Sometimes this clay can be sticky, so just pushing it with your fingers is easier. And here you can see we're getting that nice bumped out look and giving him some nice rounded shoulders. This guy's he's heavy on the torso. He is a honkin' dude up top. But here I really want to work on the bottom of the torso. It's very flat, so I'm doing everything I can to get that nice sharp flat, but also keep the roundness of the upper chest area. Now I'm just adding the line detail that he has towards the top of his chest here. Now it's up to you how much texture you want to add to your robot. I'm doing texture, I'm adding these little details here, just because I felt like if I left everything smooth and blank, it would be really boring. But it's totally up to you how you want to detail your robot. And here I realized these magnets were going to come in super handy. Then we're going to attach these chest detailing pieces that definitely don't look like anything else. We're going to blend those into the body really well. Of course, we're going to use the toothbrush of texture on these bad boys. And of course, add some details. Now these robots are supposed to be super old, so I just had to add some damage here and there on my robot. That's totally up to you. Now we're going to bulk out the hip and back area and then the front area. We're going to get that all smoothed out. We want a smooth booty. We want a smooth robot booty. There, I said it. All right. We're going to make this part up here real flat because he is a robot. And we're going to texture the heck out of him. And then we're going to add these cool little lines. Why? I don't know. But my brain said, put those in there. So I went, okay. So for the legs, I basically made a long, thin rectangle of clay, cut it down the middle, and slipped it over the armature. Then I could seal it up using some tools and then smooth it out with a little bit of water in my fingers. Once I had the shape I liked, I could go ahead and add the robot segments. Here, I'm just using this tool and pushing them in. You want them deep enough where they really show up and texturing over the top won't make them disappear. Now here, I just pushed in the clay at the bottom because I knew that the feet were going to go over the top of them. Then, of course, using my toothbrush of texture. Here, I'm just adding more of those line details going up and down on every single segment, and this added so much interest. I added a little band around the neck too for an added detail. Here you can see we have both legs and he's looking pretty good. Now for the arms, it's pretty much the same exact process as the legs. I'm just using a longer piece of clay, and of course it's a little bit trickier. If you have any areas that need more clay, just go ahead and add it and then smooth it out with some water. Here I'm indenting this piece so that the hand can fit over it. And of course, texturing and adding all the detail. Then we're going to start making the shoulder. I really made sure that these were beefy and really held the arm in place because it is a weak point on this armature and this sculpture. Did I maybe break it a couple times to figure that out? Maybe. So just make sure it's attached really well. Then I went ahead and added whatever the heck you want to call this piece. And of course, we're going to need to add the sigil that goes on the front of the robot. Now I'm making it a little bit bigger than in the movie because I just cannot sculpt that small, and I can't paint that small. So when I add the clay, I pulled some out with my Exacto and then use this tool to smooth it out. I'm going to use some water too, and of course some sanding. That's going to help us get those perfect edges we're looking for. I glued a tiny piece of sandpaper on top of a toothpick, and this allowed me to sand inside of that area, and it worked surprisingly well. Now the feet start off as just these giant lumps of clay, but we're gonna refine it, don't you worry. Now the backs have this angled shape that I saw in the book, and some little detailing really makes these look like some cute, chubby little feet. Now I went ahead and textured these, and then I wanted to make sure that my magnets were clear and didn't have any clay on them, but surrounding them so they can't pop out. After taking off these tape-made safety mittens, we're gonna work on the hand. I have never made a hand in my life, so I'm very proud of this one. It is not perfect, but I started off with basically a giant mitten. This guy has very long fingers and a long palm, so I just made sure that my proportions matched those of the robots. Then I marked out my fingers. The most important part here is making sure you round the fingers so that they don't just look flat with lines in them. You want them to look round just like a finger does. I made sure to do this all the way around the hand. Then I went ahead and marked out where all the finger joints were going to be and made sure that they wrapped around the entire hand. And then of course, we got a texture. I'm always texturing something and adding a little bit of detail. Now I knew I was going to need to make a core for the head that I could build off of. So I made this core and I got it to the shape that I wanted and added a hole so I could attach it to the armature. Then I started adding my final layer to the outside. I really worked on the shape. I ended up adding it to the end of a dead paintbrush so that I could work on it without smashing it. This allowed me to get that perfect tiny little robot head. And I had to add texture and then smooth it out. Now I learned from the book that I showed you that the face was based off of some details found inside of a watch or a clock, one of those, same thing, different size. For his faceplate, we're just gonna smooth it into the head really nicely. I'll perfect it later with sanding, so I'm not too worried about it. But we gotta make sure we add this hole. It goes deep into the face itself. And to help me make more holes in this face, we're gonna be using this super poker. My lovely friend Anthony sent out his new super poker tool to me to use and try out, and I love it. It's amazing. And you know what? We're gonna use it to poke some stuff, and it's super at it. Now that we have our holes poked in our face, we're gonna move on to sanding. Here, I'm gonna sand that faceplate nice and smooth, and then use my sanding pads to work around the edges so we get that really cool robot look face that's kind of perfect. Then I'm gonna use my hand drill and start drilling out where the eyes are gonna be and that hole towards the bottom. I'm using different sizes of drill bits and just working my way up, and this is gonna give almost a camera lens look to the eye. Here I'm refining it with an Exacto and some sanding, and more hand drills for those middle holes. Since epoxy clay can also be an adhesive, I'm going to use it to attach my head to the armature. I'm also adding some clay to the bottom of the head to finish it off with some texture, and then I'm sticking it right onto my armature. Then I'm going to connect the two. And just so this isn't too redundant, I went ahead and did the other arm, the other shoulder, and the other hand as well. Now we can work on our base. I just got this wooden base at Joann's and I'm going to cover it with some tin foil. This is going to help build up our terrain and use less clay. I also use some hot glue so I can just build up my tin foil layers and stick them together. Then I test fit my robot to see where he's going to stand. And then of course I realized I should have sanded this before I started gluing stuff to it, but I figured it out. I found this cool stain in this small little bottle and it actually worked out pretty well. There was a little bit of a learning curve, but I figured it out. I used a metal tool to help me make some holes for the plants I'm going to be putting in later. Then I used toothpicks as a placeholder so that I don't put clay over them. Now to fit my magnets, I dug some of the tin foil out, filled it with epoxy clay to hold my magnets, and then flattened the whole area out. I really want to make sure that the clay surrounds the magnet fully so it isn't pulled out of the clay itself. I used some of my leftover clay to make some blocks from our ruin. You know, hey, Laputa's a ruin. We need some crumble, we need some rock, we need some debris. After I glued my blocks into place, I'm going to cover this whole top part in a layer of clay. I work in sections, moving it around the rocks, making sure not to cover up my holes, and making sure the edges look nice. The rest of it doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to be covering it in static grass anyway. I went ahead and pulled out my toothpicks and I made a tiny little bird nest to go in the back as a little hidden gem. Now I of course wanted to add tree roots. Laputa is full of them and it just shows us how nature is taking over, so we're going to add that to our base as well. It starts off with very simple shapes, adding texture, and then adding detail over the top, and you get a pretty convincing root. I really like adding offshoots off of a main root. This really helps add some realism to it. Here I'm just using a variety of tools to get those shapes looking nice. I even curled one around our cute little bird nest. I wanted to add some vines on the back of the robot because I wanted another little surprise if you turned him around. Now I wanted to add some plants, and I found them in the aquarium section at Walmart, if you can believe it. But they need some cleanup and some shaping. So I went ahead and picked out what I wanted, tore it apart, and cleaned it up, and then figured out where I wanted everything placed. I even found a little flower for the robot to hold just like in the movie. Now the shapes are right, but the colors aren't. They're too translucent, so we're going to fix that with some paint, and we're going to add a base layer to our robot and base as well. So here I'm just airbrushing on some colors and getting rid of that transparency. I went ahead and covered the robot and the base in black. This is just going to give me a nice depth of color and a nice place to start. Then I can work on detailing our roots. I start off with a darker brown and work to different shades of lighter browns. Then I go in with some mossy green so that these look like old roots covered in moss, and then add another green over the top of that as well. The more variations of color you can add, the more realistic it's going to look. After the roots are done, I go ahead and cover the whole top part of the base in a nice green color. After finishing up the nest, I went ahead and moved on to the blocks. I started with a darker gray and just moved on to lighter grays as I went. I'm using a dry brush method here, and then I went ahead and highlighted the edges of the blocks. This just really made it come together nicely. I used a very, very light gray. And of course, don't forget to use your pinky to stabilize your brush. Gotta have your stabilizer out. Mixed a little bit of very fine glitter with some gloss and covered the blocks in it just to make them a little bit of magic, a little bit of sparkle, just a little bit of glitter. Now I mixed up my own color for the robot. Make sure you always let your paint dry so you know what it looks like when it's going to be on your sculpture. I used a dry brush method, and I think I used 2 to 3 coats of this paint to cover him entirely. Now I used my robot color, and then I went ahead and darkened it with some black. This is going to be used on all the details and in all the cracks and crevices. This is going to make all of our details really stand out. Now for the visor, I used a very brassy colored gold, and I used many thin coats. That's always the key to a nice smooth finish. For the sigil, I used a nice bright red. Then I went ahead and detailed the inside of the eye, and surprise, I made roses on the back. Aren't they pretty? I used 2 different pinks for this, and a couple different colors of brown for the vines. After I finished up the leaves, I went ahead and painted the gold of the actual Laputa emblem in the sigil off camera because I had to sit like a blind gargoyle to actually do it. It was so tiny. I covered everything in a matte varnish, and then I want to add some UV resin to that sigil. This is really going to give it a nice, clean, shiny look. I'm using UV resin here and making sure I wear gloves and a respirator. I also added UV resin to his eye because his eye actually is a lens, and this UV resin gave that effect perfectly. Added a tiny bit of gloss to the metal part around the eyes because it is shiny in the movie. Then we're going to add our moss on. I'm just adding some white glue, pouring on this moss and pushing it into the glue. I'm just going to repeat this process around the whole robot, adding in those details. You can also layer this moss, which I did on the shoulders. Here are 2 little pigeons that I painted off camera. These are for miniatures, and I thought they would be really cute and go with our bird nest. I marked out an area for those, and then I'm adding a mixture of alcohol, water, and glue and putting it over the top of the moss. This is going to harden it and make sure it can't flake off of our sculpture. Then I used a static grass applicator to apply the static grass. Make sure you read the instructions. You do not want to shock yourself or inhale any of the grass. I may have shocked myself a couple times because I wasn't paying attention. Anyway, it looks great. Now we can add our plants into all of those holes that we pushed into the clay. Here I'm just using photos I took when I had everything placed how I liked it, using that as a guide to put all these plants back where they need to go. After we get the plants placed exactly where we want them to go, I can then add the birds into this scene. I chose these birds because the birds were in the movie, but my daughter loves pigeons, so I changed them to pigeons. And I think they look rather adorable, and the little nest in back is supposed to be theirs. I even added the flower to his hand, and now we can add a nice little velvet backing to the bottom of our base. Now this backing is self-adhesive, so it's super easy to apply. Thank you so much for hanging out with me while I made this cute little robot. Make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any more of my videos.